Chapter 8. Courage Under Fire. The schoolhouse buzzed with the quiet energy of children absorbed in their lessons. Lillian moved between the desks, offering encouragement here, a gentle correction there. She paused at Tommy's desk, smiling at his careful penmanship.
"Very good, Tommy,"
she said softly.
"Your handwriting has improved immensely."
The boy beamed up at her, but his smile quickly faltered, his eyes widening as he looked past Lillian towards the door. Before she could turn to see what had startled him, the schoolhouse door burst open with a bang. 3 men, faces partially obscured by bandanas, stormed in. 2 brandished pistols, while the third clutched his side, blood seeping between his fingers.
"Nobody move,"
the tallest bandit growled, his eyes wild beneath the brim of his hat. Chaos erupted as children screamed and scrambled from their desks. Lillian's heart raced, but she forced her voice to remain calm.
"Children behind me, now,"
she commanded, spreading her arms to gather her students close. The wounded bandit stumbled, dropping a heavy sack that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. Lillian's mind flashed to Wyatt's warning about outlaws. These must be the bank robbers he'd mentioned.
"Shut those brats up,"
the leader snarled, waving his gun menacingly. Lillian lifted her chin, meeting his gaze steadily.
"They're children, and they're frightened. I'll keep them quiet, but you need to lower your weapons."
The leader sneered, but lowered his gun slightly.
"Fine, but one peep out of them and—"
"What do you want?"
Lillian asked, her voice stronger than she felt.
"We're holding up here till nightfall."
The second bandit explained, helping his wounded companion to a chair.
"You and the kiddies are going to be real quiet and cooperate, understand?"
Lillian nodded, her mind racing. She needed to keep the children safe, but she also had to find a way to alert the town. As if in answer to her silent prayer, she heard a familiar voice call out from outside.
"Miss Hawthorne, you in there?"
Wyatt. Lillian's heart leapt, but she kept her face impassive.
"Who's that?"
Lillian's mind raced.
"Just the new handyman. He was supposed to fix a loose floorboard today."
The bandit grabbed Lillian's arm, pushing her towards the door.
"Get rid of him. And don't try nothing funny."
Lillian stumbled to the door, opening it just enough to see Wyatt standing on the porch, concern etched on his features. She took a deep breath, praying he'd understand.
"Mr. Rosebriar,"
she said, forcing a smile.
"I'm so sorry, but I'm afraid we'll have to reschedule your work for another day. We're in the middle of an important lesson on local flora. It simply can't be interrupted."
Wyatt's brow furrowed slightly, but his voice remained casual.
"No trouble at all, Miss Hawthorne. When would be a better time to come back?"
"Oh, perhaps tomorrow afternoon?"
Lillian suggested, her voice higher than usual.
"The children are so engrossed in learning about thorny subjects. We wouldn't want to disturb their concentration."
As she spoke, Wyatt's eyes darted down, catching sight of a few drops of blood on the schoolhouse steps. His gaze snapped back to Lillian's face, understanding dawning in his eyes.
Of course,
He said smoothly.
I'll just head back to town then. Wouldn't want to interrupt such an important lesson."
Lillian nodded, relief flooding through her.
"Thank you for understanding, Mr. Rosebriar. Have a pleasant day."
She closed the door, turning back to face the bandits with what she hoped was a convincing smile.
"He's gone. Just the handyman, like I said."
The leader grunted, seemingly satisfied.
"All right. Back with the others. And remember, one wrong move."
Lillian nodded, moving back to stand protectively in front of her students. Her mind whirled, hoping against hope that Wyatt had truly understood her message. Outside, Wyatt moved silently around the schoolhouse, quickly locating the bandits' horses tied up behind the building. He loosened their reins, ensuring they could bolt if startled. Then he crept carefully to a window where he knew Lillian would be able to see him. Catching her eye, he pressed a finger to his lips, then pointed to the back of the schoolhouse. Lillian gave an almost imperceptible nod. Minutes ticked by, tension building in the stuffy schoolroom. Finally, the second bandit growled in frustration.
"I'm going to check on the horses.
He announced.
Make sure that handyman didn't spook them."
As soon as he stepped outside, Wyatt made his move. There was a muffled thud, and the bandit didn't return. Inside, the leader grew agitated.
"Dirk, what's taking so long?"
The wounded bandit stirred, his gun slipping from loosened fingers as he tried to stand. In a flash, Lillian snatched up the weapon, her hands shaking but her grip firm.
Don't move,
She said, her voice steadier than she felt. The leader's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed dangerously. His surprise quickly gave way to a cruel chuckle.
Well, well. Looks like the schoolmarm's got some spirit after all.
He took a step closer, seemingly unconcerned by the gun in Lillian's hands.
But tell me, Miss Hawthorne, do you even know how to use that thing?
Lillian's finger tightened on the trigger, but doubt crept into her mind. Could she really shoot a man, even to protect her students? The bandit leader seemed to sense her hesitation. His lips curled into a malicious grin.
You wouldn't want anything to happen to these little ones now, would you?
His eyes flicked meaningfully toward the huddled group of children, and Lillian felt a chill run down her spine. The threat was clear. Just then, the schoolhouse door burst open. Wyatt stood framed in the doorway, his own gun drawn.
I suggest you step away from the lady and the children.
He growled. The leader spun towards this new threat, his gun coming up with lightning speed. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Wyatt grunted in pain as a bullet grazed his arm, but his own shot went wide, splintering the wood next to the bandit's head. In that split second of chaos, Lillian made a decision. Unable to bring herself to shoot, she instead hurled the gun with all her might at the bandit leader's head. The unexpected projectile caught him by surprise. He stumbled, momentarily disoriented, his next shot going wild. It was all the opening Wyatt needed. His second shot found its mark, and the bandit leader crumpled to the floor. For a moment, the schoolhouse was eerily silent, save for the ringing in their ears from the gunshots. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the children began to cry, and the wounded bandit started to wheeze and cough. Lillian's legs felt weak, the adrenaline that had been coursing through her veins, suddenly leaving her drained. But there was no time for relief yet. She hurried to check on the children while Wyatt secured the surviving bandit.
Is everyone all right?
Lillian asked, her voice shaky but determined as she looked over each student. Wyatt approached her, wincing slightly as he held his injured arm.
That was some quick thinking, Miss Hawthorne.
He said softly.
You saved my life.
Lillian looked up at him, her eyes wide with the realization of what had just transpired.
And you saved all of ours?
She replied. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the weight of their shared experience hanging between them. Then, almost of its own accord, Lillian's hand reached up to gently touch Wyatt's wounded arm.
You're hurt,
she murmured. Wyatt covered her hand with his own, his touch sending a jolt through Lillian's body.
It's just a graze. I'll be fine.
Their eyes met, and in that moment, all the fear, relief, and unspoken feelings seemed to crystallize. Wyatt's free hand came up to cup Lillian's cheek, and she leaned into his touch, her heart pounding.
Lillian,
And then he was kissing her, his lips warm and insistent against hers. Lillian melted into the kiss, all the fear and adrenaline of the past hour transforming into a rush of emotion she could barely contain. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, reality came rushing back. The sound of approaching horses announced the sheriff's arrival, and the children's soft whimpers reminded them of their immediate responsibilities. Wyatt cleared his throat, a faint blush coloring his cheeks.
We should,
Yes, of course.
Lillian agreed quickly, smoothing her skirts.
The children!
They turned their attention to the students, still huddled behind the overturned desks. Lillian knelt down, her voice gentle and soothing.
It's all right now, children. You're safe. The danger has passed.
Wyatt crouched beside her, his presence solid and reassuring.
You were all very brave.
He added, his gruff voice softened for the young audience.
A credit to your teacher and your town.
Slowly, the children began to emerge. Lillian and Wyatt worked in tandem, offering comforting words and gentle pats on shoulders. Every so often, their eyes would meet over the heads of the students, exchanging glances filled with warmth and understanding. As the initial shock wore off, the natural resilience of children began to assert itself. Tommy, always quick to bounce back, was already regaling his classmates with an enthusiastic, if somewhat exaggerated, retelling of the events.
And then Miss Hawthorne threw the gun just like that.
He exclaimed, miming the action with gusto.
It was the bravest thing I ever saw.
Lillian felt her cheeks warm at the praise, but before she could respond, little Sarah's voice piped up.
See?
Sarah announced, her voice carrying clearly across the now quieting room.
I told you Miss Hawthorne was sweet on Mr. Jameson.
A hush fell over the schoolhouse, broken only by a few nervous giggles. Lillian felt her face flame, and she darted a glance at Wyatt, unsure how he would react to such a bold declaration. To her surprise, she found him looking at her, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. His eyes, usually so guarded, held a warmth that made her heart skip a beat.
Well, now,
Wyatt drawled, his gaze never leaving Lillian's.
I reckon Miss Sarah might be onto something there.
The tension broke as the children erupted into delighted laughter and playful oohs. Lillian couldn't help but join in, the release of laughter a balm after the fear and tension of the past hour. As the sheriff and his deputies entered to take charge of the situation, Lillian found herself standing close to Wyatt once more. His hand found hers, giving it a gentle squeeze. Chapter 9. Echoes of Doubt. The setting sun painted Sagebrush Creek in hues of gold and amber as Lillian made her way down the dusty main street. Her steps were slow, hesitant, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. It had been 3 days since the incident at the schoolhouse, 3 days since Wyatt's kiss had turned her world upside down, and 3 days of nothing. Lillian paused at the corner, her eyes drawn to the livery stable where she knew Wyatt often worked. She half expected to see his tall figure emerge, to hear his deep voice call out a greeting. But the stable remained quiet, its doors firmly closed. With a sigh, Lillian continued on her way. As she passed the general store, Mrs. Jenkins called out from the porch.
Evening, Miss Hawthorne. How are you holding up after all that excitement?
Lillian forced a smile.
Just fine, thank you. The children have been remarkably resilient.
Children bounce back quick. It's us adults who tend to dwell.
She paused, her keen eyes studying Lillian's face.
You know, I haven't seen Mr. Jameson around much these past few days. I'd have thought he'd be checking in on you, considering...
Lillian felt her cheeks warm. News of their kiss had spread through town like wildfire, courtesy of little Sarah's loud proclamation.
Oh, I'm sure Mr. Jameson has been busy,
she said, striving for a casual tone.
If you'll excuse me, I should be getting back to the boarding house.
As she hurried away, Lillian's composed facade crumbled. The truth was, Wyatt's absence was like a physical ache. After that moment of connection, that taste of what could be, his withdrawal felt even more painful than before. Lost in thought, Lillian found her feet carrying her not to the boarding house, but to the outskirts of town. Before she knew it, she was standing at the entrance of the cave where she and Wyatt had sheltered from the hailstorm all those weeks ago. The memory washed over her with startling clarity. The rumble of thunder, the warmth of Wyatt's body next to hers, the vulnerability in his eyes as he'd spoken of his past. Lillian stepped into the cave, her fingers trailing along the rough stone walls. In the dim light, she could almost see them as they were that day. Two strangers thrown together by circumstance, finding an unexpected connection.
What changed?
She whispered to the empty cave.
Or did anything change at all?
The kiss replayed in her mind for the 100th time. The tenderness in Wyatt's touch, the passion in his embrace. It had felt so real, so right. But now... Lillian sank down onto a smooth boulder, her shoulders sagging. She'd come west full of hope and determination, ready to make a difference. She'd never expected to fall in love, especially not with someone as complex and guarded as Wyatt Jameson. But fall she had, and now she was faced with a challenge greater than any she'd encountered in her new life on the frontier. How could she reach a man who seemed determined to push everyone away? And more importantly, how could she be sure that the man she was falling for was the real Wyatt, not just a fleeting glimpse of vulnerability in moments of crisis? As if in answer to her unspoken questions, a gust of wind swept through the cave, carrying with it the scent of rain and wildflowers. Lillian closed her eyes, remembering Wyatt's words from that day in the schoolhouse.
It's just words on a page, Miss Hawthorne. Don't mean nothing in the real world.
But it did mean something. It had to. The poem about the rose and the briar, love outlasting death, it had moved Wyatt, even if he wouldn't admit it. There was depth and feeling behind those walls he'd built. Lillian had seen it, felt it, and yet doubt crept in, insidious and persistent. What if she was fooling herself? What if the glimpses of warmth and vulnerability were just that? Glimpses, not to be relied upon or built into something lasting. Lillian stood, brushing the dust from her skirts. As she stepped out of the cave, the first stars were beginning to twinkle in the darkening sky. She thought of her students, of the life she was building here in Sagebrush Creek. It was a good life, meaningful and full of purpose. Did she really need more? But even as the thought formed, she knew the answer. The heart, once opened, couldn't simply close again on command. As Lillian made her way back to town, her steps were slower, more measured. She realized she was at a crossroads. She could continue to push to try and break down Wyatt's walls, risking her own heart in the process. Or she could step back, protect herself, focus on the life and career she'd come here to build. The lights of the boarding house came into view, warm and inviting. But as Lillian climbed the steps to the porch, movement across the street caught her eye. A familiar figure on horseback, silhouetted against the night sky. Wyatt. For a moment, their eyes met across the dusty street. Lillian's heart leapt, hope and fear warring within her. Would he stop? Would he finally break this agonizing silence? Wyatt's hand raised in a half wave, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Then, with a gentle nudge to his horse, he rode on, disappearing into the shadows. Lillian stood frozen on the porch, her hand gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. In that moment, she realized the true nature of what it would mean to love Wyatt. It wasn't just about breaking down Wyatt's walls. It was about finding the courage to keep her own heart open in the face of uncertainty and potential heartbreak. As she finally turned to enter the boarding house, Lillian's mind was made up. She would give Wyatt time and space, but she wouldn't give up. Not yet. Because despite the doubts, despite the fear, one truth remained. In Wyatt Jameson's arms, however briefly, she had felt at home, and that was worth fighting for. Chapter 10. Shattered Illusions. 4 days had passed since the kiss that had turned Lillian's world upside down. 4 days of silence, of stolen glances and near misses. As she walked down Sagebrush Creek's main street, lost in thought, a commotion jolted her back to the present. Tommy, one of her students, came tearing down the street, his face red with exertion and fear.
Tommy,
Lillian called out, alarmed.
what's wrong?
But the boy ran past her without slowing, heading straight for the sheriff's office. Concern overriding hesitation, Lillian hurried after him. As Lillian pushed open the door, time seemed to slow, her senses heightened by the surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. The scene before her unfolded like a tableau, each detail etching itself into her memory. Sheriff Davis stood behind his desk, both palms pressed flat against the worn wood, his face a mask of grim determination. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper than usual, speaking of sleepless nights and weighty responsibilities. To his left, Deputy Johnston's hand hovered near his holster, fingers twitching with nervous energy. His young face was pale, a stark contrast to the rich brown of his neatly pressed uniform. In the corner, slumped in a chair with his hands bound behind his back, sat a man Lillian didn't recognize. His clothes were filthy and torn, his face a patchwork of bruises and scratches. A bounty, she realized, her gaze sliding to the man who must have brought him in. And there, leaning against the sheriff's desk with an air of casual grace that belied the tension in his shoulders, stood Wyatt. Lillian's breath caught in her throat. He looked as though he'd ridden through hell itself to get here. His usually neat clothes were travel-worn and dusty, a tear in his sleeve, revealing a glimpse of tanned skin underneath. A week's worth of stubble shadowed his jaw, and his hat sat low over eyes that seemed to have seen too much. Yet despite his haggard appearance, or perhaps because of it, Wyatt's presence sent a jolt through Lillian's system. It was a complex mixture of relief, concern, and a longing so intense it made her heart ache. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the room, and Lillian saw a flicker of something in those green depths before Wyatt's gaze shuddered, his expression becoming unreadable once more. The tableau shattered as Tommy burst into speech, his young voice high with fear and urgency.
Bandits at the Johnston farmstead. They're burning everything.
In an instant, the room erupted into action. Sheriff Davis began barking orders, his voice cutting through the sudden clamor. Deputy Johnston moved with purpose, grabbing rifles from a nearby rack, and Wyatt straightened, his entire demeanor shifting from exhausted traveler to coiled spring, ready for action. As the men prepared to ride out, Lillian found herself rooted to the spot, her mind struggling to process the rapid turn of events. The captured bounty, Wyatt's unexpected return, and now this new threat. It was almost too much to take in, but as Wyatt strode past her towards the door, time seemed to slow once more. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the world narrowed to just the two of them.
Wyatt,
She said softly, her voice barely above a whisper.
be careful.
He nodded once, his jaw set with determination.
You too, Miss Hawthorne. Keep everyone safe here in town.
And then they were gone, leaving Lillian standing in the doorway of the sheriff's office, the echo of hoofbeats fading into the distance as she steeled herself for whatever challenges lay ahead. Shaking herself from her reverie, Lillian turned to the task at hand. There was work to be done, and a town to prepare for whatever was to come. Hours crawled by. Lillian helped organize the women of the town, setting up a makeshift infirmary in the church. Her hands shook as she tore strips of linen for bandages, her mind conjuring terrible scenarios. The sun had long since set when the sound of returning horses filled the air. Lillian rushed outside, her heart in her throat. She saw Wyatt dismount, relief flooding through her, but as he turned, she gasped. His shirt was soaked with blood.
Wyatt!
She cried, running to him. He held up a hand, stopping her.
It's not mine.
He said, his voice devoid of emotion.
We got 'em, all of 'em.
Lillian's relief was short-lived as she took in the grim faces of the returning men. Not everyone had been so fortunate. Later that night, unable to sleep, Lillian found herself walking towards the livery stable. She heard the rhythmic sound of brushing before she saw him. Wyatt stood in the dim lamplight, methodically grooming his horse.
Wyatt?
She called softly. He stilled but didn't turn.
You shouldn't be here, Miss Hawthorne.
The formal address stung.
I was worried about you.
Lillian said, taking a step closer. Wyatt's shoulders tensed.
There's no need, I'm fine.
You're not fine.
Lillian insisted.
What happened out there?
For a long moment, only the sound of the horse's soft nickering filled the air. Then, Wyatt spoke, his voice low and pained.
I hesitated,
He said.
just for a second, and one of our men paid the price.
Lillian's heart ached for him.
It wasn't your fault, Wyatt.
He whirled to face her, his eyes blazing.
You don't understand. I can't afford to hesitate, not ever. People die when I let my guard down.
The implication hung heavy between them. Lillian felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet.
Is that what I am to you?
She whispered.
A distraction, a weakness?
Wyatt's expression softened for a moment, vulnerability bleeding through. But then, like a shutter closing, his face hardened once more.
It's better this way.
He said, turning back to his horse.
Safer for everyone.
Lillian stood frozen, tears pricking at her eyes. She wanted to argue, to shake him until he saw reason, but the wall he'd erected seemed impenetrable.
I see.
She said, her voice barely audible.
Good night, Mr. Jameson.
As she walked away, each step felt heavier than the last. The doubt she'd been fighting roared to life, drowning out the small voice of hope she'd been nurturing. Back in her room at the boarding house, Lillian sat at her small desk, staring blankly at the wall. The events of the past 2 days swirled in her mind. The kiss, the hope it had sparked, and now this crushing setback. She'd known breaking through Wyatt's defenses wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't expected it to hurt this much. With a shaky breath, she pulled out a piece of paper and began to write.
Dear Aunt Margaret, I hope this letter finds you well. I've been thinking about the offer you made last year.
As her pen moved across the paper, the sounds of the town, settling for the night, drifted through her open window. Somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote howled, its mournful cry echoing the ache in Lillian's heart. Chapter 11. Crossroads. 2 weeks had passed since the night at the livery stable, each day stretching endlessly for Lillian. The schoolhouse bell rang, signaling the end of another day. As the children filed out, their cheerful voices a stark contrast to the heaviness in her heart, Lillian's gaze drifted to the window. She half expected to see a familiar figure on horseback riding past, but the street remained empty. Wyatt had made himself scarce these past weeks, and the few times their paths had crossed, his eyes had skittered away from hers, his responses clipped and formal. With a sigh, Lillian gathered her things and stepped out onto the schoolhouse porch. A gust of wind nearly knocked her hat off, and as she reached to secure it, she noticed an envelope tucked among her papers, her aunt's handwriting. Settling onto the porch steps, Lillian broke the seal with trembling fingers. As she read, her eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat.
My dearest Lillian, I was overjoyed to receive your letter. Of course, you must come at once. I've spoken with the headmistress at Miss Porter's school, and she would be delighted to have you join the faculty. A life of purpose and refinement awaits you here, far from the dangers and disappointments of the frontier.
The letter continued, but Lillian could read no further. She set it down beside her, her mind whirling. The offer was everything she'd once dreamed of: security, respect, a chance to make a real difference in young ladies' lives. So why did the thought of accepting fill her with such dread? Rising to her feet, Lillian began to walk, barely aware of where her feet were taking her. She found herself on the outskirts of town, the vast expanse of the prairie stretching before her. The wind whipped at her skirts, carrying with it the scent of sage and wild roses. Lillian closed her eyes, memories washing over her. The terror and exhilaration of the hailstorm, the warmth of Wyatt's arms around her in the cave, the breathless moment of their kiss after the bandit attack. Each memory a pinprick of joy, quickly overshadowed by the pain of Wyatt's withdrawal. Opening her eyes, Lillian realized she'd walked further than she'd intended. The town was a distant cluster of buildings behind her. She turned back, her steps heavy, her decision weighing on her like a physical thing. Meanwhile, Wyatt rode into town, his latest bounty secured and turned in. As he passed the schoolhouse, a flash of white caught his eye. A piece of paper tumbled across the porch, caught in the wind. Frowning, he dismounted and retrieved it. His eyes widened as he read, each word a dagger to his heart. Lillian was leaving, going back east, to a life of safety and refinement, away from the dangers of the frontier, away from him. Wyatt's carefully constructed walls crumbled, leaving him raw and exposed. He'd pushed her away to protect her, to protect himself, but in doing so, he'd driven her to leave entirely. The realization hit him like a physical blow. No walls could truly keep his heart safe. Not from this. Panic rising in his chest, Wyatt swung back into the saddle. He had to find her, to explain, to beg her to stay if he had to. But as he rode through town, checking all her usual haunts, Lillian was nowhere to be found. Back at the boarding house, Lillian moved with quiet determination. Her trunk lay open on the bed, slowly filling with neatly folded dresses and cherished books. Her fingers lingered on the volume of poetry Wyatt had returned to her, remembering the vulnerability in his eyes as he'd spoken of the rose and briar. With a sharp intake of breath, she placed it in the trunk. As she worked, Lillian's resolve hardened. She couldn't bear to stay, to watch Wyatt retreat further and further behind his walls. And she couldn't face the pitying looks of the townsfolk, all of whom had witnessed her foolish hope wither and die. The sun was setting as Lillian closed her trunk with a final, decisive click. She scrawled a brief note to Mrs. Abernathy, thanking her for her kindness and explaining her sudden departure. Then, gathering her courage, she slipped out to the stables. Her horse nickered softly as she approached. Lillian stroked its velvety nose, whispering soothing words as she saddled up. She knew it was foolish to set out alone, especially with night falling. But the thought of staying one more night, of risking a final, painful encounter with Wyatt, was unbearable. As Lillian led her horse out of the stable, the first stars were appearing in the deepening twilight. She took one last look at Sagebrush Creek, the town that had become home in so many ways. Then, with a determined set to her jaw, she swung into the saddle and urged her horse forward. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the gathering darkness, leaving behind a town unaware that it had just lost its schoolteacher and a cowboy desperately searching for the woman he'd finally realized he couldn't live without. Chapter 12. Raging Waters. The roar of the swollen river filled Lillian's ears as she urged her horse forward. Recent storms had turned the usually placid crossing into a raging torrent, but desperation drove her on. She was halfway across when her mount lost its footing. In a heartbeat, the world turned upside down. Icy water engulfed her, the current tearing her from the saddle. Lillian fought to surface, gasping for air as the river swept her downstream. When she finally dragged herself onto a rocky bank, Lillian was battered, soaked, and utterly lost. Her horse was nowhere to be seen, along with most of her supplies. All she had was the small bag she'd kept slung across her body. A few rations, flint and tinder, and the small revolver she'd purchased after the schoolhouse incident. As night fell, bringing with it a bone-deep chill, Lillian knew she needed to act.
Fire first?
She muttered, Wyatt's lessons echoing in her mind.
Fire means life out here.
Her fingers trembled as she struck the flint, but soon a small flame flickered to life. As Lillian huddled close to its meager warmth, memories of Wyatt flooded her mind. His patient instructions, his rare smiles, the strength and gentleness of his hands.
Stop it.
She chided herself, blinking back tears.
He made his choice, and I've made mine.
But as the long night wore on, Lillian found it harder to hold on to her resolve. The darkness pressed in around her, made all the more oppressive by the flickering shadows cast by her small fire. Every snap of a twig in the darkness made her heart race, her imagination conjuring images of prowling predators or ruthless outlaws. Her hand often strayed to the revolver at her hip, the cold metal both a comfort and a reminder of her vulnerability. As the hours crawled by, exhaustion began to take its toll. Lillian fought to keep her eyes open, Wyatt's lessons echoing in her mind. Sleep is dangerous out here alone. His voice seemed to whisper on the wind. You've got to stay alert. Keep the fire going. She found herself talking aloud, if only to break the eerie silence and keep herself awake. She recited poetry, sang snippets of hymns, even began telling stories to an imaginary class. Anything to stave off the crushing loneliness and fear. The fire became her lifeline, her sole focus in the vast, uncaring wilderness. Every gust of wind that threatened the flames sent a spike of panic through her. Lillian gathered what fuel she could find nearby, her movements slow and pained, acutely aware of how quickly her meager woodpile was diminishing. As she fed another branch to the fire, she found herself wishing desperately for Wyatt's steady presence, his quiet confidence, his reassuring smile. The realization of how much she had come to rely on him not just for survival skills, but for emotional strength, hit her like a physical blow. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely.
I made this choice.
She reminded herself, her voice hoarse in the night air.
I have to be strong enough to see it through.
Dawn brought little comfort. Lillian's clothes were still damp, her body aching from the ordeal. She forced herself to eat a little of her rations, knowing she needed to keep up her strength. But as she surveyed the unfamiliar landscape, fear began to creep in.
What am I doing?
She whispered, her voice small against the vastness of the wilderness.
I don't belong out here. I should have waited.
A distant howl cut through her thoughts. Wolves. Lillian's hand went to the revolver at her hip, but Wyatt's words came back to her. Wolves rarely attack humans, but they can smell fear. Stay calm, make yourself big, and they'll likely leave you be. Forcing her breathing to steady, Lillian stood tall, facing the direction of the howls.
I am not afraid,
she said aloud, willing it to be true.
I am Lillian Hawthorne, and I will survive this.
As the day wore on, Lillian's determination was tested again and again. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the damp chill of the night into stifling heat. She rationed her food carefully, allowing herself only small bites of the hard biscuits and dried meat from her pack. Each morsel was a reminder of how finite her resources were and how uncertain her future. Thirst soon became her most pressing concern. Lillian retraced her steps to the river, but its raging current made it too dangerous to approach. She remembered Wyatt's words about finding water. Follow the land downhill, listen for the sound of running water. It took nearly an hour of painstaking searching, her throat parched and her legs aching, before she found a small stream trickling between moss-covered rocks. The relief of that first sip was almost overwhelming, bringing tears to her eyes. As the afternoon wore on, Lillian knew she needed to prepare for another night in the wilderness. Shelter, fire, food, water. Wyatt's voice echoed in her mind, listing the priorities of survival. She set about gathering branches and leaves, her soft hands soon scratched and blistered from the work. The crude lean-to she managed to construct was a far cry from the cozy boarding house room she'd left behind, but it would have to do. Each task was a battle against her own limitations and the unforgiving nature of the wild. As she struggled to start a fire with her dwindling supply of tinder, Lillian found herself wishing fervently for Wyatt's steady hands and quiet encouragement. When she finally managed to coax a small flame into existence, the triumph was bittersweet, tainted by the ache of solitude. As evening approached, bringing with it the threat of another long, cold night, Lillian's facade of strength began to crack. She'd always prided herself on her independence, on her ability to face challenges head-on. But out here, faced with the vast indifference of nature, she felt small and utterly alone. The skills she'd learned, the knowledge she'd gained since coming west, all seemed to pale in comparison to the sheer scope of her predicament. With each task completed, each small victory in her fight for survival, Lillian's loneliness grew more acute. She found herself talking aloud, carrying on one-sided conversations with absent friends, if only to hear a human voice. But it was Wyatt's presence she missed most keenly. She longed for his quiet strength, his unwavering support, the safety she felt in his company. The realization of how deeply she'd come to rely on him, to care for him, hit her with startling clarity. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Lillian sat before her small fire, wrapped in the tattered remains of her shawl. She stared into the flames, exhausted and aching, but alive.
Wyatt would be proud,
She thought, then immediately chastised herself.
Stop it. He doesn't care. If he did, he wouldn't have pushed you away.
But even as she tried to harden her heart, Lillian couldn't shake the feeling that she'd made a terrible mistake in leaving. On the third day, disaster struck, As Lillian foraged for berries, a misstep sent her tumbling down a steep embankment. Pain shot through her ankle as she landed, and she knew immediately it was sprained, if not broken. Panic clawed at her throat as she tried to stand, only to collapse back onto the unforgiving ground. Her makeshift camp, with its meager supplies and the safety of her small fire, suddenly seemed miles away. Lillian attempted to drag herself up the slope, but each movement sent waves of agony through her injured ankle. As the reality of her situation sank in, Lillian's composure finally shattered. She was injured, alone, and utterly lost. For the first time since her ordeal began, she allowed herself to cry, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body.
Wyatt,
She whispered between sobs.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have stayed. I should have fought harder for us. Please, please find me.
As if in answer to her plea, a voice called out in the distance. Lillian's head snapped up, hardly daring to believe it. But there it was again, her name, carried on the wind.
Here!
She cried, her voice hoarse with tears and desperation.
I'm here.
And then he was there, bursting through the underbrush, his hat gone, his clothes torn and muddy. Wyatt's eyes were wild with fear and relief as they found her crumpled form at the bottom of the embankment.
Lillian!
He shouted, scrambling down the slope with reckless speed. He fell to his knees beside her, hands hovering as if afraid to touch her, to find her not real.
Are you hurt? God, I thought I'd lost you.
My ankle.
Lillian managed, still hardly believing he was really there.
Wyatt, how did you find me?
Without hesitation, Wyatt scooped her into his arms, cradling her against his chest as if she weighed nothing.
I'll always find you, Lillian. Always.
He said, his voice rough with emotion. As he carried her back towards her camp, Lillian clung to him, burying her face in the crook of his neck. She breathed in his familiar scent, leather, horse, and something uniquely Wyatt, and felt safer than she had in days. When they reached the clearing where Lillian had made her camp, Wyatt gently set her down near the remnants of her fire. His hands were tender as he examined her swollen ankle, but his eyes, when they met hers, blazed with an intensity that took her breath away.
I'm so sorry.
He said, his voice breaking.
For everything. I thought I was protecting you by pushing you away, but I was just being a coward. I love you, Lillian. I love you so much it terrifies me, but I can't fight it anymore. I don't want to.
Tears spilled down Lillian's cheeks as she reached up to cup his face in her hands.
I love you too, Wyatt. I tried to leave because I thought you didn't want me, but every step away from you felt wrong. I'm sorry I ran. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder for us.
Wyatt pulled her into his arms then, holding her as if he'd never let go.
No more running.
He murmured into her hair.
No more fighting what we feel. I'm yours, Lillian Hawthorne, if you'll have me.
As the sun set on their reunion, Wyatt tended to Lillian's injuries with gentle hands. They talked long into the night, the crackling fire casting a warm glow over their faces as they finally let down their guards. Wyatt sat with his back against a tree, Lillian's injured ankle carefully propped up on his lap as he applied a cool compress.
I've been a fool, Lillian.
Wyatt began, his voice low and rough with emotion.
I thought by keeping you at arm's length I was protecting you, protecting myself.
Lillian reached out, her hand finding his in the firelight.
Protecting yourself from what, Wyatt?
He was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand.
From loss, from pain. After my family. I swore I'd never let anyone get close enough to hurt me like that again.
Oh, Wyatt.
Lillian breathed, squeezing his hand.
I can't imagine how much pain you've carried.
But that's just it.
He continued, meeting her gaze.
When I thought I'd lost you, I realized that pushing you away hurt more than any loss I've ever experienced. I'd rather face a lifetime of potential heartbreak than spend another day without you.
Tears welled in Lillian's eyes.
I was so scared, Wyatt, not just out here, but in town too. I was afraid I'd never be enough for you, that I'd always be the outsider trying to fit into your world.
Wyatt's free hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a tear.
Lillian, you are my world. You brought light back into my life when I thought I'd be in darkness forever. Your strength, your kindness, your determination, you amaze me every day.
Even when I do foolish things like try to cross a raging river alone?
Lillian asked, a watery chuckle escaping her. Wyatt's lips quirked in a small smile.
Especially then. Your bravery, even when it's misguided, is one of the things I love most about you.
The word love hung in the air between them, no longer frightening, but warm and full of promise.
I was so angry with you.
Lillian admitted softly.
For pushing me away after the incident with the outlaws. I thought you saw me as a burden, a liability.
Wyatt's expression turned pained.
Never. I was angry with myself, Lillian. I let my guard down, and it nearly cost us everything. I couldn't bear the thought of you getting hurt because of me.
But don't you see?
Lillian said, sitting up straighter despite the pain in her ankle.
We're stronger together. These past few days, every challenge I faced, I overcame because of what you taught me. You've made me stronger, Wyatt.
He nodded slowly, a look of wonder crossing his face.
And you've made me stronger, too. You've taught me that there's more to life than just surviving. You've taught me to hope again, to dream of a future.
What kind of future do you dream of, Wyatt Jameson?
Lillian asked, her heart pounding. Wyatt's gaze was intense as he looked at her.
A future with you, Lillian Hawthorne, if you'll have me. I know I don't have much to offer.
You have everything to offer.
Lillian interrupted, her voice firm.
Your heart, your strength, your love, that's all I've ever wanted.
Wyatt pulled her closer, careful of her injured ankle.
Then it's yours, all of it. I love you, Lillian. No more walls, no more running. Whatever comes, we face it together.
Together,
Lillian echoed, feeling as though her heart might burst with joy.
I love you too, Wyatt, with all that I am.
And when words failed them, they let their bodies speak of love and commitment in the soft glow of the firelight. Morning found them curled together, a new understanding between them. As Wyatt helped Lillian onto his horse for the journey home, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The wild heart had been tamed, not by force, but by the strength of a love that could weather any storm. Chapter 13. 2 Hearts, 1 Horizon. The early morning sun cast a golden glow over Sagebrush Creek as Lillian Hawthorne stood before the small mirror in her room at the boarding house. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the simple white veil adorning her upswept hair. 6 months had passed since her ill-fated attempt to leave. 6 months of healing, growth, and a love that had only deepened with time.
You look beautiful, dear,
Mrs. Abernathy said softly from the doorway, her eyes misty with unshed tears. Lillian turned, smoothing down her wedding dress, a lovely creation of white lace and satin that the women of the town had worked together to make.
Thank you,
she replied, her voice wavering with emotion.
For everything. I never imagined I'd find a home like this when I first came west.
Mrs. Abernathy crossed the room and took Lillian's hands in hers.
You've brought so much to this town, Lillian. And that man of yours, well, I've never seen Wyatt Jameson smile so much in all the years I've known him.
A knock at the door interrupted them. Sheriff Davis stood there, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday best.
It's time, Miss Hawthorne. If you're ready.
Lillian took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of nervousness and exhilaration.
I've been ready for this my whole life,
she said with a smile.
I just didn't know it.
The small church was packed to the rafters. It seemed the entire town had turned out for the event. As Lillian walked down the aisle on Sheriff Davis's arm, he had insisted on giving her away in her father's absence. She felt a swell of emotion at the sight of familiar faces. Her students sat in the front rows, the girls wearing their best dresses and the boys fidgeting in stiff collars. But it was the sight of Wyatt standing at the altar that took her breath away. He cut a dashing figure in his new suit, his hair neatly combed and his face clean-shaven. But it was the look in his eyes as he watched her approach that made Lillian's heart soar. Love, wonder, and a touch of awe shone in those green depths. As she reached him and their hands joined, Lillian felt a sense of rightness wash over her. This was where she belonged.
Dearly beloved,
the preacher began. But Lillian barely heard the words. She was lost in Wyatt's gaze, in the warmth of his hands holding hers, in the profound joy of this moment. When it came time for their vows, Wyatt cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion.
Lillian Hawthorne, when you first came to Sagebrush Creek, I thought you were the most stubborn, infuriating woman I'd ever met.
A ripple of laughter went through the congregation.
I never imagined you'd also be the bravest, kindest, and most loving. You've taught me that there's more to life than just surviving. You've shown me how to live, how to love, how to hope again. I promise to spend every day of our lives together trying to be the man you deserve.
Tears spilled down Lillian's cheeks as she began her own vows.
Wyatt Jameson, when I came west, I was looking for purpose, for a place to belong. I found so much more than that. I found a community, a home, and a love I never dreamed possible. You've taught me strength, resilience, and what it means to truly trust someone with your whole heart. I promise to stand by your side through whatever life brings us, to be your partner in all things, and to love you more with each passing day.
As they exchanged rings and were pronounced husband and wife, the church erupted in cheers. Wyatt pulled Lillian close, his kiss full of promise and passion that had her blushing to the roots of her hair. The celebration spilled out into the street, tables groaning with food contributed by every family in town. As the sun began to set, casting the world in shades of pink and gold, Lillian found a moment of quiet with her new husband.
Happy Mrs. Jameson?
Wyatt asked, his arm around her waist as they looked out over the town. Lillian leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart.
Happier than I ever thought possible,
she replied.
Though I think I might keep Hawthorne for the children's sake. Mrs. Jameson might be a bit confusing in the schoolroom.
Wyatt chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple.
Whatever you want, darling, as long as you're mine.
Always,
Lillian promised, turning in his arms to face him.
You know, when I first arrived here, I thought this place was wild and untamed. I never imagined I'd fall in love with it, or with the most untamable man in town.
Oh, I'd say you've done a fine job of taming me,
Wyatt said with a wink. Lillian laughed, her heart full to bursting.
Not tamed, my love, just perfectly matched.
As they shared another kiss, the sounds of the celebration washing over them, Lillian knew that this was just the beginning. Whatever adventures lay ahead, whatever joys or challenges they might face, they would meet them together. Two hearts, once wild and searching, now beating as one, ready to forge their own path on this new horizon.